My therapist said this job would heal me, a quiet place to grieve my wife. But the list of rules left by the last guy doesn't mention healing. It mentions a voice in the dark that knows her name, a smile in the valley that's too wide. And the most important rule, whatever happens, don't let them know you're alone. They lied. I'm not alone up here, and I think I'm the one being watched. The silence is the first thing you notice. Not the gentle, peaceful quiet of a library, but a profound geological silence. It's a physical weight that presses in on you from all sides, a silence so old it feels like it has a consciousness of its own. Out here, in the sprawling, untamed heart of the Kootenai National Forest, you're not just alone. You are a statistical improbability, a single warm-blooded anomaly in a million acres of whispering pines and cold, indifferent stone. That's why I came. I wanted to be an anomaly. I wanted to be so far removed from the screaming ambulances and the sterile, beeping quiet of the hospital room that the memories would finally be starved of oxygen. My tower, Thoroughfare Lookout, is a 14 by 14-foot wooden box perched on 80-foot steel stilts. It sways ever so slightly in the wind, a constant subtle motion that you eventually get used to, like a sailor finding his sea legs. The journey up here was a trial in itself. A 2-hour drive from the nearest town, followed by a 6-mile hike up a trail that seemed determined to buck me off the mountain. My supervisor, a grizzled, leather-faced man named Randy, had met me at the trailhead. He'd hefted my pack, grunted his approval, and given me my only piece of advice. "The mountain's got its own ways, Alex," he'd said, his eyes scanning the tree line as if looking for something he hoped not to find. "Listen to it. Respect it. Don't try to make sense of it." Inside, the tower was Spartan but functional. A small cot was bolted to one wall, a wood-burning stove sat cold in the corner, and a desk with a map table and a high-frequency radio occupied the opposite side. The centerpiece of the room, however, was the Osborne Fire Finder, a beautifully archaic brass instrument used to pinpoint the location of smoke. But it was on the desk, tucked beneath the radio's logbook, that I found the document that would come to define my existence up here. It was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and soft with age, laminated in a thick, clumsy layer of plastic. The edges were worn, the corners rounded from years of being handled. At the top, in neat, blocky handwriting, were the words, "Thoroughfare rules. Read, memorize, do not discuss." I chuckled, assuming it was a prank, a little bit of hazing for the new guy. The first few rules were standard fare, exactly what you'd expect. Report any and all smoke plumes within 2 minutes of sighting. Your primary function is observation. Radio check-in with Randy is mandatory at 800 and 2000 hours. No exceptions. Keep the logbook updated hourly even if there is nothing to report. An empty log is a suspicious log. Standard, boring, bureaucratic. I was about to toss it aside when my eyes caught the 4th rule, and the tone shifted so abruptly it felt like a physical blow. The hours between 0200 and 0400 are the thin hours. Do not, under any circumstances, look down into the northern valley during this time. No matter what you think you hear, this is not a suggestion. If you see a reflection in the window glass at night that is not your own, cover it with a blanket immediately. Do not make eye contact with it. It feeds on attention. If you hear 3 distinct knocks on the hatch door from below, respond with 2 knocks, never 3. Responding with 3 is an invitation. If the generator sputters and the cabin lights flash 3 times in quick succession, lock the hatch. Bolt it. Do not open it for any reason until sunrise. Any voice you hear after the flashes, even if it sounds like Randy, is not Randy. Do not bring personal photographs into the tower. It learns faces. The voices of family, especially of those who have passed, are the easiest to mimic. They are a lure. They are always hungry. Ignore them. You are not alone here. Never act like you are. I read the list again, then a 3rd time. My initial amusement curdled into a strange sort of unease. It was elaborate for a joke. The handwriting was steady, sober. The warnings were oddly specific, filled with a kind of weary authority that was hard to dismiss. Rule 8 sent a cold spike through my gut. My wallet, sitting on the desk, contained a small folded picture of me and Sarah, taken just a year before she got sick. before the silence of our apartment became the same all-consuming silence I'd sought out here. Without thinking, I took the picture out, looked at her smiling face one last time, and then tucked it deep into the bottom of my pack, zipped away in an inside pocket, just in case. That evening, during my 2,000 hours check-in, I decided to test the waters. "All clear up at Thoroughfare," I said into the microphone, the static hissing in response. "No smoke, just a whole lot of trees. Hey, Randy, quick question for you." "Go for Randy," his voice crackled back. "The guy before me, he left a pretty funny list of rules here. Real creative stuff. Something about not looking into a valley and knocking patterns on the door. Is this some kind of rookie prank I should be aware of?" The radio was silent for a long moment, long enough for me to think the connection had dropped. When Randy finally spoke, all the warmth was gone from his voice. It was flat, cold, and heavy. "It's a lonely place, kid. Gets in your head. Just follow the rules. It's easier for everyone that way." Before I could ask what he meant by everyone, the radio clicked off. I sat there, the handset still in my hand, the silence of the tower suddenly feeling less like a comfort and more like a threat. The first night was an exercise in paranoia. Every creak of the aging wood, every gust of wind that made the tower sway, sent my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to read, but the words on the page were a meaningless jumble. My eyes kept flicking to the windows facing the northern valley, a vast black bowl of nothingness under a canopy of stars. I thought about Rule 4. What could possibly be down there? A bear? A mountain lion? The rule was so absolute, so specific. No matter what you think you hear. I managed to drift into a shallow, fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong. I fumbled for my phone, the screen glowing a sickly green, 0237. My blood ran cold. The sound came again, faint and carried on the wind. It was the sound of a child crying, a thin, desperate wail that cut through the oppressive silence of the wilderness. My first instinct, the human instinct, was to grab my binoculars, to scan the darkness, to help. But Randy's words and the stark warning on that laminated sheet held me frozen in place. This is not a suggestion. I crawled out of my cot and stood in the center of the room, my back to the northern windows, my body trembling. The crying continued, seeming to move closer. It was a heartbreaking sound designed to prey on the most basic of human impulses. I squeezed my eyes shut, plugging my ears with my fingers, but I could still hear it. Then it began to change. The sobs hitched, warped, and the pitch deepened into something guttural and wrong. The sound twisted itself into a new shape, a grotesque imitation of speech, and then I heard it, a ragged, airy whisper that seemed to come from right outside the glass. Lex. My name. It was trying to say my name. I scrambled back to my cot and pulled the rough wool blanket over my head, staying like that until the first grey light of dawn broke over the mountains and the sounds finally, mercifully, faded away. I told myself it was the wind. It had to be the wind, playing tricks on a sleep-deprived mind in a strange new place. The next day passed in a haze of caffeine and forced normalcy. I did my patrols, updated my logbook every hour on the hour, and spoke to Randy at 0800 and 2000, keeping my voice steady, betraying none of the terror that was now living in the pit of my stomach. I didn't mention the crying. I didn't mention the whisper. I was afraid of what he might say or what he might not say. As night fell again, the fear returned, stronger this time. It was a living thing, sitting beside me in the dim light of my lantern. I tried to distract myself, cleaning equipment that was already clean, reorganizing supplies, anything to keep my mind occupied. I made it a point not to look at the clock. It was around 2300 hours when it happened. The generator, which had been humming along with a steady, comforting rhythm, suddenly sputtered. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered once, plunging me into darkness. It came back on, brighter than before, held for a second, and then flickered again. It stayed dark. My breath caught in my throat. I was counting, my mind screaming at me not to. The light flashed a third time, a brilliant, blinding strobe that illuminated every corner of the cabin, and then died completely, leaving me in absolute, suffocating blackness. Rule 7. If the generator sputters and the cabin lights flash 3 times in quick succession, lock the hatch. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The main hatch, the trapdoor in the floor that led to the 80-foot staircase, was my only way in or out. I scrambled across the floor on my hands and knees, my fingers finding the heavy iron bolt. I shot it home, the metallic thunk echoing in the dead quiet. I was trapped. Or more accurately, something else was trapped out. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. For a full 5 minutes, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind outside. Maybe it was just the generator, I thought. Maybe it was a coincidence. Then, a voice called up from the base of the tower. "Alex? You up there?" I froze. It was Randy's voice, the exact same gravelly tone I'd been speaking to for 2 days. "Randy?" I called out, my voice trembling. "What's wrong? The power's out." "I know, kid, that's why I'm here. The whole grid's been acting up. My radio's on the fritz, couldn't get through to you. Figured I'd better drive up and check things out. Open the hatch, will you?" It's a long climb. His voice was calm, reasonable. Everything he said made perfect sense. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to slide the bolt back, to let my supervisor in, to have another human being here in this terrifying, oppressive darkness. But my radio wasn't on the fritz. It was battery-powered. It was sitting on the desk, its small green power light glowing steadily. Any voice you hear after the flashes, even if it sounds like Randy, is not Randy. "Alex? Come on, kid, it's cold out here. Open up." I know it's not Randy. My radio is working perfectly. But that voice, it's identical. The cadence, the accent, everything. I don't know what's standing at the bottom of my staircase, but the rules don't feel like a joke anymore. They feel like the only thing keeping me alive. If you were up here in this darkness, what would you do? If you think I should keep this hatch bolted shut no matter what, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because I have a terrible feeling that the night is just getting started. My world had shrunk to the 14 by 14 foot cabin and the heavy iron bolt on the hatch. Outside, the voice of the man who was not Randy began to change. The pretense of civility was the first thing to go, sloughing off like dead skin to reveal something raw and predatory underneath. "Don't be a fool, Alex," it rasped, the friendly gravel in its tone roughening into something like grinding stones. "I know you're in there. I can smell the fear on you. It's delicious." I crawled backwards, away from the hatch, my back hitting the cold metal legs of the map table. I tried to make myself as small as possible, a child hiding from a monster in the closet. The voice began to circle the tower. I couldn't see it, but I could hear its location shifting as it spoke, the sound moving from the base of the stairs, around to the north side, then the west. "Did Sarah smell like this before the end?" It hissed, and the sound was suddenly right beneath my feet again. That clean, sharp hospital smell, trying to cover up the decay. "I can bring her back for you, Alex. You just have to let me in. I can make her voice for you. You can hear her say I love you one more time." A sob caught in my throat, hot and sharp. It was a cruel, impossibly precise strike, targeting the wound I'd come out here to heal. The thing wasn't just a mimic. It was a parasite that fed on grief. I pressed the heels of my palms into my eyes, trying to force out the image of Sarah in that hospital bed, her skin pale and translucent. "Let me in," the voice commanded, and with each word a heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards, as if something massive was slamming itself against the steel stilts of the tower. The entire structure groaned in protest. The jars on the shelf rattled, and the firefinder's brass ring chimed with a soft, mournful note. Then, after one last furious impact that felt like it might shear the tower from its foundations, there was silence. A silence even deeper and more absolute than before. It didn't bring relief. It felt like the stillness of a predator that has settled in to wait, knowing its prey has nowhere to run. I didn't sleep. I sat there on the floor, my arms wrapped around my knees, my gaze fixed on the bolted hatch, until the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and grey. Light has never felt so much like a physical rescue. The moment the sun's rays struck the windows, I felt an irrational but powerful sense of safety, as if the creature below were a thing of absolute darkness, banished by the day. My exhaustion was a heavy cloak, but adrenaline was a fire in my veins. I unbolted the hatch, my movements stiff and jerky, and peered down the long, dizzying staircase. Nothing. I descended with my heavy-duty flashlight in one hand and a fire axe in the other, my heart pounding with every step. I scanned the clearing at the base of the tower. There were no footprints in the soft dirt, save for my own from the day before, no tire tracks from Randy's truck. There was no sign that anyone or anything had been there at all. The physical world held no evidence of my nightly torment, and for a terrifying moment, I wondered if it had all been a hallucination, a product of isolation and grief. The 0800 radio call was my anchor to reality. I had to know. My hand trembled as I keyed the microphone. "Thoroughfare to base, come in, Randy." The familiar crackle of static filled the cabin. "Gotcha, Alex. Morning. Everything quiet up there?" His voice. It was the same one from the radio yesterday, but it was nothing like the voice from the night. The casual, easygoing tone was back. I had to tread carefully. "Yeah, Randy. All quiet," I lied, my voice cracking slightly. "Hey, bit of a weird one. My generator was on the fritz late last night. Power was cutting in and out. You didn't happen to try and drive up, did you?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a beat too long. It was the same pregnant pause from when I'd first asked about the rules. "Negative, Thoroughfare," Randy said, his voice now carefully neutral. "Been at my desk since sunset, why do you ask?" "No reason," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just thought I heard a vehicle. Wind plays tricks up here, I guess." "It does more than that," Randy said, and the cryptic, ominous tone was back. "Look, Alex, you've got one job. You watch the horizon for smoke. You report it. You write in your log. You don't worry about anything else. You understand? Don't go looking for things that ain't your business." The line clicked dead. It wasn't advice, it was a warning. Randy knew. He knew what was out here, and his job wasn't to protect me, but to manage me. To make sure I stayed put and played my part in whatever grotesque cycle I had stumbled into. The confirmation that I wasn't crazy was a cold, bitter comfort. I was truly on my own. The tower was no longer a refuge, it was a cage. And if I was going to survive, I needed to understand the nature of the thing that was hunting me. The rules were a starting point, but they were purely defensive. I needed to know what this thing was, where it came from, what it wanted. My predecessor had left the rules. What else might he have left behind? Driven by a new, desperate purpose, I began to tear the cabin apart. I looked for anything that seemed out of place. I ran my hands over every inch of the wooden walls, searching for loose planks or hidden compartments. I checked under the cot, behind the sparse shelving unit, even inside the cold belly of the wood stove. Nothing. I was beginning to despair when my foot knocked against the iron base of the stove. It shifted, just a fraction of an inch, which was strange. It should have been bolted to the floor. I pushed against it. It scraped reluctantly across the floorboards. Underneath, where the stove usually sat, the floor looked different. One of the planks was a slightly different shade of pine, its nail heads less rusted than the others. My heart hammered. I jammed my fingers into the crack and pulled. The plank came up with a low groan of splintering wood, and there, nestled in the dark space below the floor, was a small tin box, the kind old-timers used for tobacco or fishing lures. It was wrapped in an oilcloth to protect it from moisture. With trembling hands, I lifted the box out. It was heavier than it looked. I pried open the rusted lid, and inside I found a slim leather-bound journal, its pages warped and stained by time. On the first page, in the same neat, blocky handwriting as the list of rules, was a name and a date. Frank Miller, Lookout, season of '87. I sat on the floor, the open journal in my lap, and began to read. June 12th, 1987. Arrived at Thoroughfare today. The silence is everything they promised. Supervisor's name is Henderson, grumpy old coot. He left a ridiculous list of rules on the desk. A practical joke, obviously. Still, there's something about this place. It feels watchful. Probably just my city nerves getting the better of me. My eyes scanned down the page, my own experience mirrored in his words. June 15th, 1987. Couldn't sleep last night. Kept hearing something from the valley to the north. Sounded like a woman crying. Every instinct told me to look, but Henderson's face when I mentioned the rules, he wasn't joking. I kept my back to the window. Then the crying changed. It started to sound like my mother, calling my name. She's been dead for 10 years. A chill traced its way down my spine. I flipped through the pages. The entries became more frequent, the handwriting more agitated. June 22nd, 1987. It happened. The lights. 3 flashes, just like the rule said. Then Henderson's voice from the bottom of the stairs saying his radio was broken. My radio was working fine. I kept the hatch bolted. The thing outside got angry. It screamed at me in a voice that wasn't human. It called me a coward. It knew about my brother, David. It knew how he died. How could it know that? I'm calling it the echo. It takes things from inside you and plays them back to you, twisted and wrong. He'd named it. The echo. It was a perfect, chilling description. I continued reading, my dread growing with every page. Frank wrote about seeing a pale, fleeting reflection in the window that wasn't his. He wrote about the 3 knocks on the hatch and how he'd almost responded with 3 out of sheer instinct before catching himself. The journal was a chronicle of his descent from skepticism into sheer, unadulterated terror. He was living my life, decades before I arrived. Then I reached the final entry. It was dated July 9th, 1987. The neat, blocky script was gone, replaced by a frantic, barely legible scrawl that dug into the paper. It's a game. The rules aren't to protect me. They're to prolong the game. It's been toying with me for weeks, and I think it's getting bored. Or maybe I am. I can't live like this, jumping at every shadow, dreading the sunset. I have to see it. I have to know what I'm hiding from. Tonight I break Rule 4. I'm going to look into the valley. Maybe if I see its face, it will lose its power. Maybe knowledge is the only weapon I have left. That was the end of the entry. But below it, squeezed into the bottom of the page, was one final, terrifying sentence, the ink smudged as if written in a great hurry. I saw it. God help me. I saw it. It's not an echo. It wears a face. It's wearing the face of the lookout from the season before me. The smile is too wide. It's coming up the sentence ended there, in a long, jagged smear of ink that tore the paper. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The man before Frank. The echo had taken his face, and then Frank. He had become the face the next thing saw. A horrifying, cyclical pattern emerged in my mind. We weren't just victims. We were templates. We were the masks it would wear for the next person in line. As that horrifying realization settled over me, a new sound cut through the silence of the cabin. It was the radio. It had switched on by itself. It wasn't tuned to Randy's channel. It was just static. A thick, hissing wall of white noise. But underneath the static, almost too faint to hear, was something else. A melody. Tinny and distorted, like an old music box winding down. It was a tune I recognized from my deepest childhood memories. A lullaby my mother used to sing to me. And as I listened, frozen in place, a single, clear, childlike whisper bloomed out of the static, a voice that was both alien and intimately familiar, and it sang a single, chilling line. And if that mockingbird don't sing. The lullaby hung in the air long after the radio fell silent. It was a phantom, an auditory afterimage that coiled itself around the inside of my skull. It wasn't just a song, it was a key, one that unlocked a dusty, forgotten room in my memory where I was 6 years old, sick with a fever, and my mother was humming that exact tune to ward off the nightmares. The echo, or whatever it was, hadn't just found a song. It had found my song. It had rooted through my mind like a pig digging for truffles and had pulled out the most tender, vulnerable memory it could find. In a surge of pure, unthinking rage, I grabbed the radio and hurled it against the wall. The plastic casing shattered, spilling a nest of wires and circuit boards onto the floor. For a moment, there was a satisfying finality in the act, a reclamation of the silence. But the silence that rushed in to fill the void was different. It was heavier, watchful. I hadn't banished the entity. I had just destroyed my only potential lifeline. I had broken the second rule on Randy's list. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. I was now blind, deaf, and utterly, completely alone. The days that followed ceased to be discrete units of time. They became a single, continuous smear of dread, punctuated by the rising and setting of a sun I barely noticed. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. When I did succumb to exhaustion, my dreams were a chaotic hellscape of hospital corridors and whispering forests. I dreamt of Sarah, but her face was always wrong. Her smile stretched just a little too wide, her eyes holding a vacant, predatory glint. I would wake up gasping, my heart trying to batter its way out of my chest, the line between the dreaming and the waking world dissolving into a terrifying fog. My own mind became the enemy. The profound isolation began to work on me, sanding down the edges of my sanity. I started seeing things, or more accurately, I started almost seeing things. In the periphery of my vision, shadows would detach themselves from the corners of the room and flow like ink, only to vanish the moment I turned to look. I'd catch a flicker of movement in the tree line below, a tall, impossibly thin shape slipping between the pines, but when I focused my binoculars on the spot, there was nothing but swaying branches. I started talking to myself, my own voice a desperate anchor in the crushing silence. I would read Frank Miller's journal aloud, his words a grim liturgy. I'd recite the rules over and over, a litany against the dark. Rule 5. If you see a reflection in the window glass at night that is not your own, cover it with a blanket. I began to avoid my own reflection, catching glimpses of a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger with a scraggly beard and a permanent hunted expression. Was that me? Or was it what the tower was turning me into? The entity seemed to sense this weakening of my resolve. It changed its tactics. It had tried to lure me out with a child's cry and to intimidate me with Randy's voice. Now, it began a campaign of psychological warfare, a siege laid against my very soul. One evening, as I was huddled by the stove, trying to coax some warmth into my bones, I heard it. A whisper. Not from outside, not from the broken radio. It was inside the cabin with me. "Alex, honey, you'll catch a chill." The voice was my mother's. It wasn't a memory. It was real, airy and close, as if she were standing right behind me. I spun around, the fire axe in my hands, my eyes wide and frantic. The cabin was empty. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice a pathetic, trembling thing. The whisper came again, laced with a gentle, chiding affection I remembered so vividly it made my chest ache. "Don't you recognize your own mother? You were always such a worrier. Rule 9, the voices of family, especially of those who have passed, are the easiest to mimic. They are a lure. They are always hungry." I squeezed my eyes shut, chanting the rule in my head. "You're not real," I whimpered, backing away until I hit the far wall. "You're not her." A soft, sad sigh filled the room. "I'm so cold, Alex." He said if you'd just open the door, I could be warm again. The manipulation was so transparent, so horrifically cruel, yet for a split second, the grieving child inside me wanted to believe it. I wanted my mother. I wanted to be safe. But I knew what this was. This was the echo, wearing my mother's memory like a coat. I stayed pressed against the wall until the sun came up, my knuckles white on the handle of the axe, listening to the voice of the woman who raised me as it pleaded, cajoled, and finally wept with a terrible, hollow sorrow. That was the first crack in the dam. The second one broke me. It happened 2 nights later. I was lying on my cot, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a sound that turned my blood to slush. It was the sound of Sarah laughing. It was her laugh exactly. That unrestrained, joyful sound that had been the soundtrack to the best years of my life. It wasn't coming from outside or from a specific point in the room. It was everywhere, as if the air itself was laughing at me. "Sarah," I whispered, the name a shard of glass in my throat. The laughter softened, turning into a contented sigh. "Do you remember that night, Alex?" her voice murmured, so close it felt like it was breathing against my ear. "At the lake? The Perseid meteor shower. You made a wish on every single one." My heart seized. It was a memory I hadn't shared with anyone. A perfect, private moment. How could it know? "I remember," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. I wished for 1,000 more nights just like that one. "I'm still here, my love," the voice whispered. "I'm right outside, but it's so dark. The man with the wide smile, he won't let me go. He said, "You have the key. Please, Alex. The hatch. Let me in. I miss you so much." This was a different kind of torture. My mother's voice had been a lure. This was an vivisection of my soul. It was using my deepest love, my most profound loss, as a weapon. It was holding the ghost of my wife hostage. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the emptiness, clawing at my own hair. The gentle, loving voice of Sarah vanished, replaced by a cold, sibilant hiss that slithered through the cabin. "We want to see your face," it whispered. "We want to wear it." I finally understood. It wasn't about getting inside. It was about breaking me down, eroding my identity, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell for it to occupy. Frank Miller wasn't just killed, he was replaced. The echo was a collector. Desperation gave way to a sliver of defiance. I wasn't Frank, I wouldn't let it win. I scrambled to the wreckage of the radio, frantically trying to splice wires together, hoping for a miracle. Maybe I could get a signal out, a distress call on an emergency channel. After an hour of frantic work, I managed to draw a spark of life from it, a low hum, and then a cascade of static. "Mayday, mayday, mayday!" I yelled into the detached microphone, my voice hoarse. "This is Thoroughfare Lookout. I am in danger. My name is Alex Coleman. I need immediate evacuation. There is something here. It is not human." For a second, the static cleared. I thought I heard a voice, a distant dispatcher. Hope, bright and piercing, flared in my chest. But then the static returned, and woven within it was the sound of a hospital ventilator, the steady, rhythmic hiss pump that had haunted my nightmares for months. And then, Sarah's voice, weak and struggling for breath, whispered from the speaker. "Why did you let me go, Alex? Why didn't you save me?" I threw the microphone away as if it were burning hot. The entity didn't just control the airwaves, it controlled my reality. It had sealed me inside a bubble of my own personal hell. The sky had been growing dark all afternoon, the clouds gathering in a bruised, angry mass. As night fell, the storm broke. It wasn't just rain, it was a biblical deluge. Wind howled like a banshee, throwing itself against the small cabin. The entire tower swayed violently, groaning under the strain. Rain hammered against the glass windows with the force of thrown gravel, and then the lightning started. Each flash was a silent, blue-white explosion, bleaching the world of color for a split second before plunging me back into near-total darkness. The thunder that followed was a physical concussion, a crack that sounded like the sky itself was splitting apart. I was in the heart of a maelstrom, 80 feet in the air, a prisoner in a glass cage. My paranoia was at a fever pitch. Every flash of lightning populated the woods below with an army of dancing, distorted shadows. I stumbled around the cabin, trying to cover the windows with blankets as per Rule 5, but the storm was too violent. The wind tore them from my grasp. I was exposed, illuminated by the storm's strobing, erratic light. I stood in the center of the room, spinning around, trying to watch all directions at once, my sanity fraying with each thunderous blast. Then came a flash of lightning so bright, so close, that the world outside was rendered in perfect, stark detail. It was in that searing, instantaneous moment of clarity that I saw it. Pressed against the glass of the north-facing window, the window looking out over the valley, was a face. It was pale, the color of bleached bone, and slick with rain. Its features were vaguely human but elongated, distorted, as if seen through a warped lens. It had no hair, no ears, just smooth, luminous skin. Its eyes were two deep black pits, voids that seemed to drink the lightning. And its mouth, dear God, its mouth. It was stretched into a fixed, impossibly wide smile, a crescent of blackness that split the lower half of its face. It was a smile of pure, cosmic malice. I saw it for no more than a second, but a second was an eternity. The thunderclap that followed was so loud it shook the fillings in my teeth, and I was plunged back into darkness. The afterimage of that horrific, smiling face burned onto the backs of my eyelids. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound of an animal caught in a trap, and collapsed to the floor. It was there. Not at the bottom of the stairs, not in the woods below. It was here. It had climbed 80 feet in the heart of a hurricane just to look at me. just to let me know that the rules, the locks, the walls, none of them mattered. When it wanted to, it could get to me, and it was smiling. The storm passed as abruptly as it had arrived. One moment the tower was a vessel tossed on an ocean of violent sound and fury. The next, there was only the gentle patter of water dripping from the eaves and the distant sigh of the wind through the sodden pines. The world outside had been washed clean, baptized in lightning and rain. It smelled of ozone and wet earth, a scent that should have been cleansing but instead felt funereal. I had not been cleansed. I had been marked. The image of that pale, smiling face was seared onto my soul, a brand of pure, psychic horror. I spent the hours until dawn huddled in the driest corner of the cabin, the fire axe held tight against my chest. The fear was no longer a sharp, piercing thing. It had settled, cooled, and hardened into something else entirely, a cold, dense certainty. I was not going insane. The whispers, the voices, the flickering lights, they were not phantoms of a grieving mind. They were the calculated, deliberate actions of a predator, and last night, that predator had come to my window to show me its face. It had shown me that 80 feet of steel and a bolted hatch were meaningless inconveniences. The game had changed. Hiding and waiting was no longer a strategy. It was merely a delay of the inevitable. Frank Miller's journal had proven that. He had followed the rules. He had cowered and hidden, and in the end it had come for him. My only chance, I reasoned with the strange detached clarity that follows a bout of absolute terror, was to understand the game board itself. The rules were the enemy's playbook, not my own. What I needed was the history, the context. I needed to know who else had sat in this chair, who else had watched this same unchanging panorama of trees, and who else had met the thing with the smile that was too wide. My search began with a new, methodical desperation. I had found Frank's journal beneath the stove, a place of warmth and heart. Where else would a person in profound isolation leave their mark? I ran my hands over the rough-hewn wooden walls, feeling for loose knots or hollow spots. I emptied the supply lockers, tapping on the bottoms and sides, listening for any variation in the sound. It was in the locker designated for emergency rations, a grimly ironic label, that I found the first clue. Tucked away at the very back, behind dusty tins of beans and desiccated fruit, was a section of the wall where the wood was darker, worn smooth by countless hands. At first, I saw nothing. But as the morning light shifted, casting long shadows across the room, I saw them. Etchings. Names and dates, carved into the wood with what must have been a knife point or a nail. They were small, almost invisible, unless you were looking for them. T. Henderson, 62, M. Rourke, 65, J. Albright, 71, S. Gable, 78, F. Miller, 87. My breath hitched. Frank's name was there, and before him a grim lineage stretching back decades, a chain of men, each serving their term in this purgatory. Each name was a ghost. I traced the faint letters with my fingertip. These were my predecessors. These were the faces the echo had likely worn. I looked closer, noticing oddities. There was a large gap between 78 and 87. Had no one been stationed here? Or had something happened that required the records to be scrubbed, the name physically gouged from the wood? Below Frank's name there was another, more recent carving. The lines were fresher, the wood lighter. D. Miles, last season. David Miles, the man who came immediately before me. The man whose job I had so eagerly taken. The man who, I now suspected, had not retired peacefully. He was the reason I was here. I was his replacement in the cycle. The discovery of the names hardened my resolve. I was not just fighting for my own life. I was a part of a dark and bloody history. The tower wasn't just a lookout post, it was a feeding station. This thought propelled me to search with even greater ferocity. If Frank had left a journal and others had left their names, surely there was more. My attention turned to the desk. It was a heavy, utilitarian piece of furniture, probably as old as the tower itself. I'd already checked the drawers, but as I ran my hand along the underside, my fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood. It was a small leather pull tab, almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark stain of the desk. I pulled. A section of the desk's underside, a false bottom I never would have suspected, dropped open with a quiet click. Inside the shallow compartment, lay a small portable cassette player and a stack of 6 cassette tapes, each labeled with a year. 71, 78, 94, 03, 11, and one simply marked last season. It was a library of fear, an oral history of the damned. I felt a profound sense of reverence and terror as I picked up the cassette player. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the voices of the dead. I checked its batteries, my hands shaking so badly I could barely slide them into the compartment. I took the first tape, the one marked 71, and slotted it into the machine. I pressed play. The hiss of the old magnetic tape filled the cabin. Then, a man's voice, surprisingly calm and laced with a faint southern accent, began to speak. It was Jay Albright. Log entry, July 3rd, 1971. The strangest thing last night. Heard music out in the woods. Sounded like an old-timey waltz, the kind you'd hear on a gramophone. Just for a minute, then it was gone. Henderson, my supervisor, same name as the 62 fella carved in the wall, must be a family business, told me not to worry about it. Said the mountain plays tricks. I fast-forwarded, the tape squealing in protest. July 10th, the music came back. This time I saw a light with it. A single bobbing lantern way down in the valley where no trail is. It feels beckoning, like it wants me to come down for a dance. I'm keeping the hatch locked at night now, no matter what Henderson says. I skipped ahead to his final audible entry. His voice was no longer calm. It was tight with panic. It's mimicking the fire bell now, the emergency signal. 3 rings, pause 3 rings, but there's no fire. I called it in and Henderson got real quiet. He told me, "Son, whatever you do, don't go outside to check the bell. It's not trying to lure me with voices. It's trying to trick me with my duty. It's learning." The tape ended abruptly with a click. It was learning, evolving its methods. I put in the next tape, 78, S. Gable. His voice was different, deeper, more cynical. It doesn't want to trick me. It wants to trade. It whispers things in the static, secrets. It told me where the foreman of the old logging company hid his money. It told me about Supervisor Henderson's sick wife. It offers knowledge, but I think the price is your sanity. Last night it showed me something. In a dream, or maybe I was awake, I don't know. It showed me the stars shifting, the constellations rearranging themselves into a smiling face. It's not from here. It's ancient and it's fallen and it's so hungry. My hand was trembling as I reached for the final tape, the one marked last season. David Miles. His voice would be the key. I pressed play. The quality was better, the hiss less pronounced, but the terror was sharper, more immediate. His voice was a ragged, breathless whisper, as if he were trying not to be overheard. It knows my daughter's name. It keeps singing the songs from her favorite cartoon. It stands at the bottom of the stairs, and it projects her voice, begging me to let her in so we can watch it together. Randy, the supervisor, probably Henderson's grandson, the family business continues, is useless. He's not a supervisor, he's a zookeeper. He just brings the fresh meat and makes sure the enclosure is secure. The zookeeper, the fresh meat, that's what I was, that's what we all were. I get it now, David's voice continued, a horrifying epiphany dawning in his tone. The rules, I thought they were a survival guide. They're not. They're a recipe. They're instructions for how to marinate us, how to break us down slowly, fill us with the right amount of fear and paranoia and despair to make us palatable. It doesn't want a victim who dies of a heart attack on the first night. It wants to savor the process. It wants to peel you apart, layer by layer, until it knows you better than you know yourself. Following the rules doesn't mean you survive. It means you die correctly. A wave of nausea washed over me. Every action I had taken to protect myself, locking the hatch, ignoring the voices, averting my eyes, had been nothing more than me playing my part, following the script written for me by the monster that was hunting me. "I'm done playing," David whispered, his voice gaining a strange, reckless edge. "I'm done being the rat in its maze. There's only one rule that seems to matter to it, the invitation, the consent. It tricks you, it begs you, it coerces you, but in the end, you have to be the one to open the door, respond to the knock, or accept the trade. That's the core of the game. So I think I've finally figured it out. I know how to lose." There was a fumbling sound, the clink of metal. "The hatch has been bolted for a week," he said, his breathing heavy. "I'm going to open it. I'm not going to wait for it to knock. I'm going to break the pattern. Maybe that's the only way to truly leave this place." The tape kept recording. I heard the distinct heavy sound of the iron bolt sliding back, a low creak as the hatch door was pushed open. Then a long, drawn-out silence. I held my breath, my ear pressed against the small speaker. The silence was broken by a soft, almost inaudible sound, a gentle musical humming. It was the lullaby, the mockingbird song, my mother's song. It had learned it from him. It had practiced on him. The humming was followed by a sharp, wet, tearing sound and a single choked-off scream. David's scream. Then nothing but the soft, hissing sound of the blank tape spooling into eternity. The hiss of the blank tape was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a sonic vacuum, the sound of a life being neatly and efficiently erased. David Miles had tried to lose the game on his own terms, to break the cycle by offering himself up. But he hadn't lost. He had been consumed. The lullaby was the proof. His memories, his fears, his love for his daughter, they had all been absorbed, catalogued, and added to the entity's horrific arsenal. The echo hadn't just taken his life, it had plundered his soul for spare parts. I sat there on the cold wooden floor, the cassette player silent in my lap, and I felt a profound tectonic shift within me. The fear that had been my constant companion for weeks, that frantic, heart-pounding terror, was still there, but it had been displaced from the driver's seat. In its place was a cold, crystalline rage, a rage for Frank Miller and his smudged ink, for Jay Albright and his phantom waltz, for S. Gable and his star-dusted nightmares, for David Miles and his daughter's stolen lullaby, and for Sarah, whose sacred memory was now a puppet in this thing's profane theater. David had been right about the rules. They weren't a shield, they were a marinade. They were a set of behavioral controls designed to prime the subject for harvest. Every night I spent cowering, following the prescribed rituals of denial and avoidance. I was simply tenderizing my own psyche, making myself a more savory meal. Every rule I obeyed was an act of participation in my own demise. The logical conclusion was as terrifying as it was inescapable. If following the rules leads to being consumed, then the only path that offers even a sliver of a different outcome is to break them. Not haphazardly like Frank, who had let his curiosity overwhelm him, and not as an act of surrender like David. I would have to break them with intent, with purpose. I would have to take the game board they had laid out for me and flip it over. I was no longer interested in surviving the night. I was interested in burning the whole goddamn theater to the ground. My eyes scanned the laminated list of rules now lying on the map table. My gaze fell upon Rule 6. If you hear 3 distinct knocks on the hatch door from below, respond with 2 knocks, never 3. Responding with 3 is an invitation. The invitation. David had said it himself. It seemed to be the one constant, the one through line in this nightmare. The entity needed some form of consent, however coerced. It needed to be let in, whether literally or metaphorically. The 3 knocks were a question, a call and response ritual. 2 knocks was the correct dismissive reply, the no thank you that kept the game going. 3 knocks, then, was the ultimate acceptance. It was the RSVP to your own slaughter. It was the one thing you were never, ever supposed to do. And that is what I decided I would do. I wasn't suicidal, I was homicidal. I was going to invite the monster into my house, but I was going to be waiting for it with an axe. It was a plan born of pure, unadulterated desperation, a final, defiant roar against the encroaching dark. If I was going to be erased, I would not go quietly. I would make my ending a wound. Preparation became my new religion. I spent the entire day turning the cabin into a fortress and a trap. I barricaded the windows with the heavy map table and the cot, leaving only a narrow slit to peer through. I didn't want to keep it out. I wanted to channel its point of entry. I wanted it to come through the hatch, where I would be waiting. I took the heaviest wool blankets and soaked them in the emergency supply of kerosene, draping them over the wooden support beams. The whole tower would become a funeral pyre if necessary. My primary weapon was the fire axe. I spent an hour sharpening its blade on the small whetstone from the toolkit until it could shave the hair from my arm. It felt solid and real in my hands, a stark contrast to the ethereal nature of my tormentor. I also had a flare gun with 3 precious cartridges. I had no illusions that a flare would physically harm the creature I'd seen at the window, but light, intense and sudden seemed like the only other weapon I possessed. It had appeared in a flash of lightning. Perhaps a flash of magnesium would be equally unwelcome. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in violent hues of orange and purple, I made my final preparations. I stood in the center of the room, the axe in one hand, the flare gun tucked into my belt. I was no longer the trembling man who had arrived weeks ago, seeking solace. The solace I had found was the cold, hard clarity of a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. I had been hollowed out by grief, and now that hollow space was filled with a resolve as hard as granite. Let it come. Let it look into my eyes and see not a terrified victim, but a mirror of its own implacable hunger. Night fell. The tower was plunged into a blackness so complete it felt viscous. I extinguished my lantern, knowing that any light would only serve my enemy. I would fight it in the dark, on its own terms. I stood by the hatch, my bare feet planted firmly on the wooden floorboards, my breathing slow and controlled. The silence returned, that deep, ancient silence of the mountain, and for hours it was my only companion. My senses were stretched to their breaking point. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of a pine needle against the glass was magnified into a potential threat. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow tightening of a knot in my gut. It was testing me. It knew I was expecting it. It was letting my own imagination do the heavy lifting, populating the darkness with 1,000 different horrors. Then, just after midnight, it came. Knock. The sound was not loud, but it was so distinct, so deliberate, that it vibrated through the floor and up my legs. Knock. It was the sound of a knuckle on wood. Measured. Patient. Knock. 3 knocks. The question had been asked. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird in a cage of bone. My throat was dry. My carefully constructed rage felt 1,000,000 miles away, replaced by the primal, familiar taste of fear. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. The voice of David Miles echoed in my mind. I know how to lose. I lifted the butt of the axe. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I was not losing, I was choosing. I brought the handle down against the floor. Thud. The sound was an answer. Thud. A confirmation. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Every instinct, every warning from the journal and the tapes screaming at me to stop. Then I thought of Sarah's stolen laughter, and my hesitation evaporated. Thud. 3 responses. The invitation was delivered. For a long moment, the silence that followed was absolute. It was a void, a held breath. I wondered if I had been wrong, if the ritual was just another one of its games with no real meaning. Then, a low, scraping sound began. It didn't come from the hatch. It came from the walls, all of them at once. It was the sound of 1,000 fingernails dragging across old, dry wood, a skittering, scratching cacophony that seemed to come from both inside and outside the cabin simultaneously. The tower began to shake, not the gentle swaying of the wind, but a violent, rhythmic tremor, as if some colossal beast were trying to uproot it. The kerosene-soaked blankets slipped from the beams, pooling on the floor. The jars on the shelves I hadn't cleared fell and shattered, the sound lost in the growing din. Suddenly the lights flickered on. The single bulb overhead blazed with an impossible white-hot intensity, searing my retinas. They flashed once, twice, a third time, and then died, plunging me into a darkness that was now filled with floating purple after-images. My broken radio crackled to life on the floor, the static roaring like a jet engine. And through the static, a voice emerged. It was not my mother's, not Sarah's, not Randy's. It was my own. Calm, clear, articulate, a perfect recording of me. "Final rule, Alex," my own voice said, its tone devoid of any emotion. "You can't run from the thing that's already inside you. Now, open the door." I stared in horror at the hatch. The heavy iron bolt, which I had left securely in place, began to slide. It moved slowly, smoothly, retracting into the door with a soft metallic whisper, pulled back by no visible hand. The hatch was being unlocked from my side, from inside. A final, terrifying click echoed through the cabin as the bolt cleared its housing. A low groan followed as the heavy trapdoor began to rise, inch by agonizing inch, opening a square of profound, impenetrable blackness into my sanctuary. I had invited it to my door, and it was already in my house. This is it. I can hear the air moving in the stairwell, a slow, cold breath from the world below. The hatch is open. The thing I invited, the thing I challenged, is coming. What do you think is down there waiting in the dark? A creature with claws and teeth, the ghost of a long-dead lookout? Or is the truth something so much worse that my mind will simply break when I see it? Leave your theories in the comments, subscribe if you want to know what happens to the people who work these lonely jobs, and wish me luck. The sun is a long way off, and I don't think I'm going to see it. The open hatch was a wound in the floor of my world. It did not disgorge a monster, or spill forth a chorus of damned souls. It was simply a hole, a perfect square of abyssal blackness that seemed to absorb the very texture of the room around it. The scratching from the walls had ceased. The phantom voice on the radio had fallen silent. The only sound was the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart, a drumbeat for a ritual I had initiated, but no longer understood. My own voice, spoken from the broken radio, echoed in my mind. Open the door. But the door was already open. The bolt had slid back on its own, a puppet pulled by unseen strings. I stood with the axe raised, my knuckles white, my body coiled like a spring, waiting for the pale face and the lacerating smile to rise from the darkness. I waited for a hand, a claw, a tendril to snake over the edge of the opening, but nothing came. The blackness was utterly still, utterly silent. It was a patient, profound emptiness. The air that rose from it was cold and carried the scent of deep earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old blood. My defiance, my carefully constructed rage, began to feel absurdly misplaced. How do you fight a hole? How do you strike at an absence? This, I realized, was the true nature of the torment. It wasn't going to be a physical confrontation. It was a test of nerve. It was going to wait in the dark until I either lost my mind or my will to live. It would let the silence and the paranoia do the work for it. David Miles had opened the hatch and been met with a lullaby and a scream. I had opened it and was being met with nothing. The game had evolved once more. A new thought, sharp and terrifying, pierced through my fear. What if the voice on the radio was right? What if the threat wasn't coming through the door? What if it was telling me to go through it? The rules, the voices, the reflections, they were all designed to keep me in the tower, to keep me trapped. My act of defiance, responding with 3 knocks, had broken the enchantment, had unlocked the cage. The silence wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity, an escape. It was a desperate, insane leap of logic, but it was the only one I had left. Staying here meant a slow, agonizing descent into madness. Going down those stairs, and that was the unknown. That was the choice nobody else seemed to have made. With my heart in my throat, I crept towards the gaping hole. The axe felt heavy and useless. I peered down into the stairwell. The darkness was absolute, a vertical tunnel that seemed to descend into the very core of the earth. I couldn't see the ground, the stairs, anything. "I'm not playing anymore," I whispered into the void, the words sounding thin and foolish. "I'm leaving." I slung the axe over my shoulder, took the flare gun from my belt, and turned, lowering my legs into the opening. My feet found the top rung of the staircase. The metal was so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. Step by step I began to descend, leaving the relative safety of the cabin behind, plunging into the waiting, silent dark. The climb down was the longest journey of my life. Each of the 80 feet was a universe of terror. The steel staircase was a fragile spine in a vast, empty blackness. The wind had picked up again, and it whistled through the steel supports, sounding like thin, reedy whispers. I kept my eyes fixed on the patch of starry sky visible through the open hatch above, a receding square of hope. I didn't dare look down. I didn't dare look out into the forest. My foot touched solid ground. I was at the bottom. I scrambled away from the base of the tower, spinning around, my back against one of the massive steel pylons, the flare gun raised and ready. The forest was preternaturally still. The wind that had been howling through the struts of the tower was absent down here. The air was heavy, unmoving. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, painting the clearing in a cathedral of silver and shadow. There was nothing there. No pale face, no smiling man. No evidence of the storm or the psychic violence that had been waged against me. A giddy, disbelieving laugh escaped my lips. I had done it. I had faced the thing, broken its primary rule, and walked out. The tower was the source of the evil, a cursed place, and I had left its confines. I was free. The laughter grew, bordering on hysteria. I had survived. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to look back, to see the cage I had escaped from one last time. I turned my gaze upward, tracing the 80-foot skeleton of the tower up to the small square cabin perched at its apex. And my laughter died in my throat, choked off by a sob of pure, uncomprehending horror. There was someone in the lookout tower. A figure was standing at the north-facing window, the very same window where I had seen the face in the storm. It was a silhouette against the lesser dark of the cabin interior, still and watchful. As I stared, my blood turning to ice, the figure moved slightly, stepping into a patch of faint moonlight that filtered through the glass. I could see its face. It was my face. It was me. A perfect, living, breathing replica of myself was standing in that room, looking down at me. It raised a hand, my hand, and gave a slow, deliberate wave. Then, its features began to shift. The corners of its mouth, my mouth, began to pull back, stretching wider and wider, peeling back from the teeth in a grotesque, inhuman arc. The smile I had seen on the pale face in the window now wore my own features as its canvas. It was a tear in the fabric of a human face, revealing a void of absolute malignancy beneath. The horrifying algebra of the place slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The tower wasn't a cage to keep me in. It was a mold. The rules weren't a defense. They were a calibration process. The entity didn't want to kill me. It didn't want to drive me mad. It wanted to learn me. It had spent weeks probing my memories, my fears, my loves, cataloging every nuance of my personality, not to torment me, but to build a perfect copy. It didn't want my life. It wanted my space. The invitation, it wasn't for the entity to come in. It was for me to leave. By breaking the final rule, by descending those stairs, I had willingly vacated the vessel. I had completed the final stage of my own replacement. As this realization crested, the world began to dissolve. My feet were no longer on the ground. The solid weight of the axe disappeared from my shoulder. The flare gun fell from a hand that was no longer there, clattering uselessly onto the pine needles below. I was becoming thin, translucent, my substance giving way to memory. I was an echo in the making. I tried to scream, but I had no lungs. I was a consciousness untethered from flesh, a ghost born not of death, but of eviction. A new sensation bloomed where my stomach used to be, a cold, placid hunger. I looked down at my fading, spectral hands and understood what the whispers in the forest were. They were the leftovers, the discarded originals. Albright, Gable, Miller, Miles, we were the gallery of ghosts, the library of echoes that the creature used to decorate its hunting ground. From my new, weightless perspective, I saw a pair of headlights cutting through the distant trees, slowly navigating the winding service road. It was a pickup truck, Randy's truck. He wasn't bringing supplies. He was bringing the next lookout, the next template, the next set of memories to be plundered. Up above in the tower that was no longer mine, a light flickered on. The thing wearing my face moved away from the window and over to the desk. I could feel its presence, solid and real, a usurper on my throne. After a moment, I heard a sound drift down through the still night air, a sound I knew intimately, but had never heard from the outside. It was the crackle of the high-frequency radio, and then a voice, my voice, calm and steady and utterly devoid of fear, cut through the silence of the Montana wilderness. "Thoroughfare lookout to base," it said, the words clear and precise. "Nightly check-in, all quiet up here. The last tenant left the place a bit of a mess, but I'll have it cleaned up by morning. It's ready for the new season."